Welcome to Discover ASAP, the video interview series where we highlight the top findings and tools connected to the ASAP network. Today, I'm talking with Karin Cox, a postdoctoral researcher on Team Strick. For today's episode, we're going to be discussing code developed by Team Strick, which detects rhythmic spiking through the power spectra of point process model residuals. Thanks so much for joining me today, Karin. Can you briefly tell us about your ASAP project and how this code is being used for the project?
Okay. So on Team Strick, we study generally the contribution of basal ganglia networks to the emergence of Parkinsonian motor symptoms. So for our project specifically, we're asking about paradoxical kinesia. So this is a phenomenon that many people have heard of, where under some special circumstances, individuals will show this sudden and dramatic improvement in motor abilities. So some of the classic examples that are given refer to situations where there's a lot of stress or strong emotion. So you might think of someone having to evacuate when there's a fire alarm or another emergency. Maybe they typically experience akinesia, bradykinesia, but when that alarm sounds, they suddenly move very quickly and fluidly. So that's what we refer to as paradoxical kinesia. We often abbreviate as just PK. So what our team hypothesizes is that there's a circuit that runs through the ventral putamen. It receives input from limbic areas and projects multisynaptically to motor cortex that might help mediate this effect. So in our labs, I'm in the Turner lab, and we take a neurophysiological approach to this question. So we're looking at ventral putamen, and we're looking at other related areas, and seeing how the activity relates to paradoxical kinesia. And so the way that the tool that I developed is useful is it's a method for detecting rhythmic spiking in neuronal firing. And so it's a very well-established correlate of Parkinsonian motor symptoms that you typically see these strong oscillations, often in alpha or beta frequency bands, so ranging from 8 hertz at the lower level up to about 30 hertz. So it's reasonable to expect that might also be something that we see in play in paradoxical kinesia as well, maybe the increases and decreases in tandem with the improvement in motor symptoms in some of the regions that we're studying.
Great. Thanks so much for that. I think this is a really fascinating question, and I'm always excited when somebody's studying something that I think is often understudied in the Parkinson's field. So can you give us a brief overview? You've touched on this a tiny bit, but can you go into more detail about what exactly this tool that you've developed does, and sort of, give us a brief overview of it?
Mm-hmm. So we've essentially developed a new method. There's also some corresponding code that's available on GitHub that we released along with our publication that can be somewhat used as a reference for how someone might go about trying to implement it. But as I said, its main objective is to detect rhythmic spiking in single unit spike trains. And the reason that's a little bit challenging is that there's this problem that is really specific to looking at single unit activity. And I think to explain that, it would be helpful if I could share a slide.
Great.
All right, can you see that okay?
Yep, that looks great.
Okay. So I don't know if you can happen to see my cursor.
Mm-hmm, I can.
Okay. So what I'm showing here in this figure, if you look at the bottom panel, this is a pair of segments from some simulated spike trains. And what you see in the panels above, these show the components that go into the probability function that was used to generate these spikes, and then the final probability function down here. So when we're simulating like the most basic kind of oscillating spike train that we can imagine, it could just have perhaps 3 components. So one component is just the baseline firing rate, which could be more or less vigorous as I've depicted across these columns. In addition to that, we have some basic oscillatory drive, which I have depicted here at about 9 hertz in the alpha band. And then in addition to that, any neuron, we're going to have what I'm terming here the recovery period. So I'm essentially using this as a substitute for the term refractory period because in practice, empirically, we typically assume that the pause in firing, the characteristic pause in firing after an individual spike, it can sometimes be much longer than what we can really attribute to refractoriness alone. So we just refer to this as the recovery period to be a little bit more mechanism neutral. So it's this recovery period that really causes the issue for detecting rhythmicity. And to explain that, it really helps to look at the power spectra. So that's what's shown here on the right. So if I take the entirety of these two simulations that I did and just perform very standard spectral analysis on them, plot the power spectral density, or PSD, that's what this looks like if you look at the black lines. And also notice here on the frequency axis that I've kind of zoomed in on the lower frequencies. So if this were a situation in which all that I had simulated was just a baseline firing rate and an oscillatory drive, then what we would see here in both of these is a relatively flat spectrum with just that isolated peak sitting on top around 9 hertz. But that's obviously not what we see. So this is the characteristic distortion effect of the recovery period, where you have over the lower frequencies a relative trough, and then over the upper frequencies it's elevated, and it's almost sort of like this ringing pattern. So people have known about this problem for quite a while, for decades, and there have been some methods put forth to try to address it that we thought weren't quite satisfactory. And so what my method does is it tries to find a new way to go about correcting for this distortion, so you can make an assumption that the baseline is basically a flat spectrum and has just that isolated peak sitting on top of it. If you could make that assumption, then you can apply this fairly standard statistical test that people like to use on spike oscillations, where you look over a high frequency range of the power spectrum, assume that's going to be relatively flat, because the neurons were generally going to be looking at oscillations down here. Take a mean and a standard deviation over that, get an upper confidence bound, and see if any peaks happen to exceed that bound. That's clearly not working very well when the units are distorted like this, but we argue that if you can make the baseline flat, then that simple test does work. So that's what my code tries to do, is tries to take out that distortion.
Great, thank you for that explanation. So you sort of started to hint at this, but I'm hoping you can talk a little bit more in depth about the advantages that your method has over how this was previously done, and sort of what, which I think gets at why you created this tool.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, that'll be helpful to go ahead and share again. Okay, so left off there at the power spectrum. So as I said, there have been some methods that exist already, but we didn't find them quite satisfactory. So that's what I'm going to illustrate here in these new panels. So the established method that our lab and many other labs has used in the past is this kind of shuffling-based method. I don't necessarily need to go into great detail, but just to illustrate the underlying weakness. So the basic procedure is that you take the original spike train, you create several copies of it in which you've preserved the distribution of the interspike intervals, but you shuffle them around. So you take, for each of those, randomize those shuffled spike trains, you take a power spectrum, you get a control power spectrum out of that, you take the average of those, and that's thought to capture a lot of the variance that is attributable to factors like the recovery period, while hopefully retaining a good bit of the remaining of the oscillation that you're looking for. So if you look at the red lines in these plots, that's actually that control power spectrum that shuffling is estimating. And what we found is that if you have a moderately firing unit, so this might be characteristic of a firing rate we would see in a region like internal globus pallidus. If we have a moderate firing rate, this actually doesn't do that bad. The control spectra manages to capture this lower level distortion without eating into the peak. So the standard procedure is to just divide out this control spectrum and then just perform analysis on what's left. Here this works pretty well. That green dot is basically what exceeds the confidence bound is within this search region that we're interested in of below 100 hertz. So this procedure here, it's effective just with shuffling alone. But what we found with lower firing rate units, like we might see in the striatum, which is of course of interest for our project, is that this procedure can be a little bit too aggressive. And so it will start to capture a little bit of that oscillatory peak. When you have this really low firing rate unit, it's really depending even on that basic information in the ISI distribution to really inform to make it so that you can detect the presence of that rhythmicity. So you perform this standard division, standard statistical test, and you're still not capturing this alpha band peak that you want to find. So we really just wanted to address that problem. We wanted to be able to detect rhythmicity in lower firing rate regions such as the striatum. So we devised a different procedure, and I'm happy to talk about it more offline or whenever if anybody wants more details, and you can look at our paper. But essentially, we developed a Poisson regression model. So we first run this algorithm on the spike train that tries to estimate the duration of the recovery period. And then we set up a point process model that estimates the variance in the time series that's associated with the recovery period. And then it can essentially try to extract that variance out, resulting in a corrected time series. So then you submit that corrected time series to spectral analysis and ideally reach your goal of an otherwise flat spectrum with the peak that you're looking for. And that's what we see in these examples here, is that we are able to detect the oscillation in both the high firing rate and the low firing rate case. So that is essentially what we were trying to achieve with this tool.
Great. I think that is amazing and clearly something that's very needed. So you just talked about already some of the advantages of this new tool over previous methods. But I want to ask if you're working on any developments to add any increased functionality to the code as you continue to work on this project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is important to touch upon. And one more slide. Okay. So we find that the code works very well on simulations such as that which I showed you on the last slide, and on many empirical units as well. So we've tested this on units from the basal ganglia and also from thalamus. But what we did find in some of our empirical data was another issue that the residuals method, and also to some extent really the shuffling method, don't always successfully address. So this is what I'm showing you here, an example unit. I believe it's from motor thalamus. And it's showing you the power spectrum after I have applied residuals correction. So what you see here in the dotted line is that confidence bound I was talking about. And it's labeling all these points up here as reflecting significant oscillations. And we don't know the ground truth for this neuron, but we're guessing that's probably not the case. What's most likely is that there could be some periodic activity here around a beta frequencies, maybe 12, 13 hertz. And then what we're really seeing here is the classic sort of 1/f trend that people will be very familiar with if they've done a lot with like LFPs or EGs or some kind of continuous signals. People haven't really talked about it so much in spike trains, but it very much tends to show up. So in order to really be able to apply that simple statistical test that I talked about before, where we assume that the baseline is just flatness and we're just looking for isolated peaks above that, we really need to address this kind of distortion as well, in addition to the recovery period distortion, at least in those units where it arises. So since this is so common amongst people who study continuous signals like LFPs, there are a lot of ideas from that field of what we might try to apply to correct for this. So this is something we're looking around, we're trying different things, and we're seeing what works reliably best on spike trains to try to remove this trend. So that's really our next goal for this method.
Great, that's good to know. So I think that it's relevant also to know, that you're working on addressing this, but that it seems like that's something that someone should keep in mind if they're planning to use this code for their own project. Is that there is this limitation that it doesn't always maybe accurately capture some of those peaks if there's this 1/f phenomenon happening. Are there any other special considerations that someone should keep in mind if they're using this code?
Mm-hmm. So the one other consideration that I think is important is that it does assume stationarity. So the data that you apply it to, you should be able to assume that throughout the data that you submit to the algorithm, that the oscillation that you think it's going to be present similarly throughout that data. So that could be because you have a continuous period of data where you think the conditions are relatively similar. The oscillation should have no reason to fluctuate a whole lot throughout. Or you could also set it up so that you submit isolated windows, like segments of data where you think that the oscillations should be occurring similarly. And I show in the GitHub code, I demonstrate how to handle that both ways. But in both cases, really, that's that that stationarity assumption holds. There are some ideas that I put, for example, in our publication of how one might extend this to do time frequency analyses like wavelets and that sort of thing, where you expect the oscillations to be regularly fluctuating. But that, again, is really an area of future development.
Great. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me about this tool that you guys have developed. If you guys are interested in learning more, please check out the GitHub repo and their publication, which will be linked below.